All right. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Richardson, and I have Professor Michael Krenn here. And we're going to talk a little bit today about Black diplomacy, specifically about Professor's book, and also just the history of African Americans in the Foreign Service. So, Dr. Krenn, thank you so much for joining me this Sunday evening. How are you doing today?
I'm doing just fine, Chris. Thank you.
Great, 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 great. Professor Krenn, you earned your PhD from Rutgers. You're originally from Texas, and you are the author of Black Diplomacy and the Color of Empire.
Yes.
And so it's funny that I came across your book about in 2013, 2014. I was a Foreign Service officer, and I was writing an encyclopedia on the American Civil Rights Movement. And when I picked up your book in the process of researching this book I was writing on the civil rights movement, and two things jumped out to me when I was doing research on the civil rights movement. One was that the Foreign Service, in almost every book I read, came across as adversarial or indifferent to issues of race, both home and abroad. Um, I think the first time I really saw the Foreign Service in a book about the civil rights movement was Judgment Days about Lyndon Johnson and
Mm.
Martin Luther King's relationship, where basically the State Department refused to help Martin Luther King when he won the Nobel Peace Prize in Oslo.
Right.
They refused to help him in Oslo. They refused to help him in London. And I thought, wow, that's kind of weird because that's not the organization that I think that I know.
Yeah.
And then I found your book, and I found it just so shocking, the history of Black diplomacy. I'm going to read for you a quote from the Secretary of State. He said he was concerned about the small number of African Americans in senior positions because it is of fundamental importance that the service represent the culture and ethnic diversity of our society. This is simply not a personnel issue. It's a foreign policy problem which affects our image as a nation. Now, the Secretary of State who said that wasn't Mike Pompeo, it was George Shultz in 1986.
Right.
And you had an interview with Terrence Todman, Ambassador Todman, where he
Hmm.
said that the biggest issue with the State Department was the fact that they talk about these things and they talk so eloquently about these things, but at the end of the day, there's no follow through.
Right. Right.
But before we get into that, I want us to talk just a little bit first about African American diplomats and where they came from, and just a little bit about the history of the Foreign Service before the Rogers Act. If you could just talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, before the Rogers Act, which came about in 1924, designed to quote unquote professionalize the diplomatic corps. Prior to that time, you did have African American service diplomats. The first official African American service diplomat was back in 1869, and that was Ebenezer Bassett. He was appointed by Ulysses S. Grant to Haiti. And from that time onward, from 1869 on, there were a handful of African Americans who were appointed. Some of them were very well known. Ebenezer Bassett, not well known, unfortunately. Although a Foreign Service officer, Chris Teal, just made a fascinating documentary about Bassett called A Diplomat of Consequence. But there were others. Frederick Douglass, for example, was appointed. James Weldon Johnson was appointed. Almost all of these individuals were political appointees. Almost all of them went to Haiti, although that was not always the case. Johnson, for example, went to Venezuela, and there were others. Yeah, yeah, there were others. There were others. Richard T. Greener, for example, who was the first African American to graduate from Harvard. He served in Russia during the late 1800s, early 1900s. So there were a few. There were a few political appointees. Republican administrations would typically fill the spot in Haiti, and one or two African Americans would be appointed every year. None of these men were professional, quote unquote, diplomats, and even if they had wished to, they would not have had full time diplomatic careers. They were political appointees They were made generally by Republican administrations to sort of say thank you to the African American vote. So
And
very, very limited.
and it's important to point out that for people who are thinking about the historical context of this, that after the Civil War and African American men were given the right to vote, no women were ever given the right to vote until the 1920. But African American men were a huge, important part of the Republican Party at that time.
Yes.
It's thought that Ulysses S. Grant probably didn't win the 1868 presidential election without African American voters. He had been the greatest Union general, and it's probable that white Americans voted against him. And most Republican presidents, really up until Wilson, somewhat owed their vote to African American voters who could vote in the North. And so, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in the Black press and in the Black media at that time, it was always a really important thing to have a Black diplomat. And it was seen as, and Republicans got a lot of credit for the fact that they had these very few African Americans. And I think in your book, you had mentioned a quote from one historian who said that not necessarily in the Foreign Service itself or the consular service, but in the general State Department, that State Department actually did a pretty good job of having African Americans back then. But then, Woodrow Wilson won the presidency. Could you talk just a little bit about what happened when Wilson won the presidency to many of these African Americans?
Well, when Wilson won the presidency and took office in 1913, his racial views were already very well known. One of the first acts he undertook is when he got into Washington was to segregate federal office buildings. His views on race were well known to everyone, and he did not continue the tradition of appointing African Americans, even to the position in Haiti. For a period of time there, for the 8 years when Wilson was in office, that was sort of a dead time in terms of African Americans finding many opportunities in the State Department. Almost all of them had to be appointed. Almost none of them were going to get jobs in the Department of State. And so they really had to rely on this presidential largesse in terms of giving these appointments to African Americans, which, as you noted, the African American press, African American magazines, they celebrated these appointments. These were high-profile appointments. They were important appointments. But when Wilson came in, that sort of drew the curtain on any sort of progress in terms of African Americans in the department.
Mm-hmm. What came? So the Rogers Act passes and is signed in 1924. What was driving that desire to have a quote unquote professionalized foreign service?
Well, because it wasn't very professional, by and large. The Foreign Service was really a hit or miss sort of affair. When you had all of these political appointments, that meant that many of these political appointments were done to pay off debts. They were pay off people who had served the party, people who had gotten the vote out, people who had made generous contributions. That did not mean they were good diplomats. And you had some extraordinarily embarrassing situations with some of these completely incompetent individuals. Supposedly serving the interests of the United States abroad, and there were a couple during the Wilson administration in particular of some people who really they were extraordinarily embarrassing and humiliating events. And I think the idea was that with the nation's presence growing in the world, with World War I now, the United States had taken its place on the world stage. You really couldn't depend on just having presidents picking out their pals and their donors and the folks that they thought deserved a shot at a diplomatic post. You needed a more professional diplomatic corps to carry out policies now around the world.
And so they passed the Rogers Act, and I'd interviewed the grandson of Clifton Wharton, the first African American career person. And could you talk a little bit about, so they have like this written exam and oral exam. Mr. Wharton passes it. Could you talk a
Right.
little bit about the State Department and Joseph Gru's reaction to his passage of the Foreign Service exam?
Well, almost as soon as the Rogers Act went into effect, Joseph Gru, who was the chairman of the Foreign Service Personnel Board, received a memo from several of his colleagues in the Department of State, um, basically laying out their objections to this new system, opening up the possibility that these different kind of people would now be available, because this was supposedly all based on merit. If you applied, passed the written exam, passed the oral exam, you were in the Foreign Service. And they were quite fearful, and they identified three particular groups. They said women, naturalized citizens, and African Americans. And their suggestion to Gru was simply to either, if someone happened to sneak by and get through the process, simply say, well, there aren't enough posts available, or try to drown them out at the oral exam. If they passed the written exam, there wasn't much they could do about that. But at the oral exam, of course, there was a great deal of flexibility there. And their idea was you simply drive these people away. And Clifton Wharton, Sr., who was already in the State Department, he was actually the first African American to hold a desk position at the Department of State. He was a legal clerk. And when the Rogers Act was passed in 1924, he took that opportunity. He said, well, I'm going to apply for this. And he took the test and passed, and took the oral exam and got through there. But Gru was very clear in a memo that he wrote to one of his friends shortly after that. He said, only about 16 or 17 passed, including one Negro who will immediately be sent to Liberia. And Gru was not kidding. I mean, the day after Wharton passed that exam, he was appointed to Liberia, and he wasn't even given the required training at the Foreign Service School. He was shipped off with some speed, I think. As a matter of fact, I've got a quote here. There was an African American newspaper that ran a cartoon, and it published an editorial cartoon. Wharton is shown knocking at this door of the State Department's diplomatic school, and a white official is leaning out one of the upstairs windows, and it throws him a diploma out of the window and yells, "Here's your diploma, and we have a ship waiting to take you to Liberia." And that's exactly what happened. Wharton was appointed. The next day, he's appointed to Liberia, and off he goes.
And Joseph Gru and the Foreign Service Personnel Board, in your book, you talk about how they wanted the president to do an executive order, basically, it's specifically barring blacks, women, and these naturalized Americans from being able to join the Foreign Service.
They did, and to the credit of the White House and the Secretary of State at that time, they did not want to do that. They said that issuing an executive order like that is going to be counterproductive. We've set up this Foreign Service exam, which is supposedly, quote unquote, merit-based. You can't suddenly now start saying that, well, it's merit-based for certain people. But I think, as the memo to Gru and Gru's comments suggested, that there were ways to weed out African Americans. And between 1924 and 1949, only 5 African Americans passed the Foreign Service, got into the Foreign Service during that time. So that shows you that even though it's supposedly a merit-based system, there were still ways to weed out what Gru and his people would define as the undesirables.
And in your book, you talk about how those 5 African Americans spent 98% of their 53 years, collective years, in the quote unquote Negro circuit, or the Chitlin circuit, as they called it. Could you talk a little bit about what is the Negro circuit?
The Negro circuit was the extraordinarily limited number of posts that African Americans were sent to. And you're quite right. What I discovered in doing the book was that those first Foreign Service, African American Foreign Service pioneers, 98% of their time was spent in 4 posts: Monrovia and Liberia, the Azores, Canary Islands, and Madagascar. The only person who escaped that was Giles Hubert, who served in Haiti for a short period of time. But what happened, and Wharton was a perfect example. He's sent to Liberia. He spends many years there. He's sent to the Azores. He's sent to the Canary Islands. He's sent to Madagascar. And he ends up back in Liberia. And that was generally what happened. It really was a circuit. They might get reposted elsewhere, but they were never going to get out of that circuit.
Wow. And so we get to the 1950s. Congress does a study in 1949. I think it was Congress or someone did a study in 1949 on the lack of diversity at the State Department, calling on the State Department to do more diversity and to do more. And their excuse basically in the 1950s was either A, most countries don't actually want Black diplomats, and therefore we're protecting them by not appointing them to these other countries. Or something called the Lily White security clearance process. Could you talk a little bit about what is the Lily White security clearance process?
Well, the Lily, yeah, that came up when I was looking at it. It actually had to deal with the appointment of an African American representative to the United Nations. That was another sort of general appointment that was made. It was always assumed there would be one African American who would be appointed to the UN, America's UN team. And Secretary of State John Foster Dulles was being pressured. He was being pushed. He said, you've got to find an African American to serve in the UN. And his response was pretty clear. He said that the problem with it is we can't get African Americans through their FBI checks because of their involvement with civil rights groups. And then he said, with apparently no self-realization whatsoever, that even Ralph Bunche couldn't get through Lily White through these security checks. And so yeah, that was one of the ways they tried to keep African Americans out. And you mentioned 1949. That was really what started the study for me, was finding that memo from 1949, in which the State Department said, the memo, the title was "Countries to which an outstanding Negro might be appropriately sent as a U.S. ambassador." And through this 4 or 5 page memo, they managed to identify one outstanding Negro, Ralph Bunche. They kept saying that again and again. If we could only find somebody like Ralph Bunche.
But he still can't be a Foreign Service officer because he never passed the Lily White test.
No. And appropriate countries, the memo just went through and said, well, Latin America will resent having them. Asia will resent having them. The Middle East will resent having them. And once you got down to the end of that memo, the field was extraordinarily limited.
Wow. And so in the mid 1950s, well, one, do we have a sense of how many African Americans actually wanted to be in the Foreign Service? One thing that I saw in your book, and that's actually still an excuse, it's an excuse today by the State Department, is as well, African Americans just don't want to be diplomats. We don't have enough people who want to apply to the Foreign Service. Do you have a sense of how many were applying or did the oral exam? Did the state keep records of that information?
I was never able to find any records that they kept of the racial makeup of the applicants. In terms of the people who got in, of course, they kept very, very good records about that. But anecdotally, what I would suggest is one of the things that it surprised me, and it shouldn't have, but because you think of African Americans so focused on the domestic issues, the civil rights issues here at home, I was somewhat surprised to see so much intense interest in the African American press, the African American newspapers, the African American magazines, the NAACP, very extraordinarily interested in these foreign policy issues of colonialism and imperialism and the apartheid system, and foreign aid and aid to Africa. These were things that were not just occasionally mentioned in these newspapers, it was all the time. And then when you combine that with the fact that you consistently had groups throughout the late 1940s, and throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s, groups of African Americans from non-governmental organizations, from universities, meeting with representatives of the State Department to plead with them to please give us more opportunities. Please give African Americans more of an opportunity. Please give us more of a voice. So to suggest that the interest wasn't there, it seems to me, based on the evidence I've come across, that's just absolutely fallacious. The interest was there, at least on the African American part.
And so we start to see a trickling of more African American diplomats in the 1950s. One of them being Terrence Todman, who was from the U.S. Virgin Islands.
Yes.
And you interviewed him and Edward Dudley and other African American leaders, those early leaders at the State Department.
Right.
And you know, in the op-ed I wrote to the New York Times, I mentioned this segregated dining facilities, and how State Department basically put up a barrier between the segregated and integrated side. Could you talk a little bit about just a little bit about that, and what did Terrence Todman tell you when you interviewed him about that?
Yeah, well, those issues of what these early African American diplomats faced. I mean, you can go all the way back to Ralph Bunche in the late 40s when he was offered a position as an assistant secretary of state, and he said, "I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to live in Washington D.C. I'm not going to subject my children to a segregated school system, a segregated city." But when Todman joined in the Department of State, the Foreign Service, of course, he faced even more challenges because he was viewed, and he said this in the interview, he was viewed almost as a foreigner because he's from the Virgin Islands. And his first few days in the Foreign Service around the State Department were spent people asking him, well, what are we going to do with you? And but one of the things that really incensed him was when he went for his Foreign Service training, there was a restaurant. And there wasn't any place else to eat, but that restaurant was segregated, and the State Department wouldn't do anything about it. But Todman kept hammering away at this, kept pressing away at it, and finally, as you said, what happened was the restaurant put up a wall. One side of it remained the segregated restaurant for the public. The other side was the integrated restaurant for Foreign Service and State Department individuals. And as Todman concluded, he said, well, and people thought I was a little bit of a troublemaker, but that was okay.
Just for that. You know, I've always been fascinated by that story. Did you ever think about interviewing, or have you interviewed any of the white officers from this period? Because I would be really interested to know what did they tell themselves about the idea that, you know, their black colleague is going to this integrated part and they're going to the segregated part, or maybe they're going to the integrated part with Terrence Todman. Did you ever think about interviewing any of the white officers from that period?
You know, at the time I didn't, and I reflect back on it now, and that was probably a really missed opportunity. I was so focused on trying to get the African American voice because some of these folks were already passing away. And people like Edward R. Dudley, he was very up in years by the time I spoke to him, and a number of the others were quite old at that time. But I do think that was a missed opportunity to speak to these folks and to find out what did they think about it. I mean, because there were people in the department and the Foreign Service who were very sympathetic to this viewpoint, who were helping to try and push for a more diversified Foreign Service and State Department. But as I also know from these interviews, there were certainly some people that were not as interested in diversifying the Department of State.
Right, and still aren't. You know, it's interesting that you know, with thinking about the segregate, that when I put that sentence in the op-ed, I think that was one of the most commented on things, was the fact that, you know, how could U.S. diplomats ever allow segregation? And I heard from a lot of white officers who are like, oh man, I would never allow that, which is interesting because, you know, in the Foreign Service, as Foreign Service officers, in our own cafeterias today, we're segregated out from local staff. A lot of us won't even eat with local staff. You know, like local staff will eat on one side of the room, the Foreign Service officers will eat on the other side of the room. And so it's always fascinating to me that officers are like, oh, I can never live under segregation. It's like, really? Because I don't know how many of you actually bother to eat with the local staff. And you walk right past them. A lot of us do.
Right.
And I think that's just one of those things that we have to think about today. And I know I'm going to just stick to one more topic on the 50s, and then we'll move on because I don't want to take up like all your night. But could you talk a little bit about the unfinished business exhibit, where the State Department put up an exhibit against segregation, and
Right.
then felt the need to take it down because it wasn't balanced?
Yeah, yeah. The unfinished business exhibit is really one of the most fascinating efforts by the United States during the 1940s and 50s, and even into the 60s, to try and deal with the racial issue, because we were getting clobbered, not only by the Soviets but by many of our allies, because of our dismal record on civil rights. We were trying to promote ourselves as the leaders of the free world, as the leaders of democracy, of equality and freedom. Well, all you had to do was pick up a New York Times newspaper and read about the latest lynching or beating or burning or this or that. And so it was a real public relations problem for the United States. And for many years, throughout the late 1940s into the late 1950s, the general response of the United States was, well, it's not really that bad. This is basically communist propaganda. It's not that bad. It's limited. It's basically in the South. And we're trying to do things about it. So just ignore it. It will go away. But then, of course, came Little Rock in 1957, the explosion of international interest over the pictures of these children trying to get into a school. And it was a public relations disaster for the United States. So when the 1958 World's Fair came along, USIA, state, the other people working on the fair came up with something called the unfinished business exhibit. And they were going to look at three problem areas of the United States. And one of them was urban housing. Another one was soil erosion, conservation problems. But the big ticket issue was they were going to deal face to face with the civil rights issue. And so the unfinished business exhibit started out with one room with newspaper clippings showing how bad it was. I mean, they just went through newspapers and showed the pictures and the headlines about how devastatingly bad the civil rights issue was in the United States. And then you went to a second room with a number of pictures about improvement. You know, more African Americans going to school, more African Americans getting professional jobs, more African Americans doing this and that. And then the third room was simply a huge picture of what we want for the future. And that was a multiracial group of children playing Ring Around the Rosie. And that was sort of the picture for the future. And it sounds harmless enough now. You'd say, well, of course, they're simply reporting what was going on in the United States. But Southern congressmen exploded. They absolutely exploded. For example, Mindell Rivers from South Carolina said, "Well, why don't we show the real problems in America, like Puerto Ricans?"
Oh my God!
Yeah. And the Southern congressmen just were incensed. How dare you claim this to be a problem? And the Eisenhower administration almost immediately closed down the unfinished business exhibit because Eisenhower's views on race are fairly well known as well. He was one who simply didn't think it was the place of the federal government to tell people to do these sorts of things. So it was closed down. Some pictures were taken out. There was a picture in one room of a college dance of a young African male dancing with a white woman. That was just taken out immediately. The newspaper headlines were sort of crushed up. They shrank down the picture of the children playing Ring Around the Rosie, and they reopened it for a short period of time, but that did not assuage the fears of the Southern congressmen. And eventually we closed it down entirely, despite the fact that the people on the ground, the guides, and we even had some African-American guides at Unfinished Business writing back to Washington saying this is having a dramatic effect. The European audience, because this was a fair held in Brussels, the European audience is affected by this. They're saying the United States is forthrightly trying to face its race problem, and now you're closing it down, which makes us look even worse. So when people ask me what impact does race have on foreign policy, I always point to Unfinished Business. Here was a Cold War propaganda mechanism that was working, but race trumped it. The racism in America trumped it. It couldn't compete, even though it was helping us win the Cold War, and it was just unceremoniously closed down.
Wow. And could you talk a little bit about, so we did Ambassador Dudley, our first African American ambassador, career ambassador. Could you talk a little bit about how he got that position after his many years in the Foreign Service, and also what happened after he left?
Right. Well, Dudley was a political appointee. He had worked for the NAACP for a number of years. He'd worked with Thurgood Marshall in their legal office. Actually, fascinating career. He actually worked in the Negro Theater unit of during the New Deal. But he'd gone to law school, got his law degree, worked with the NAACP for years, worked down in the Virgin Islands in a government appointment for a short period of time. But in 1948, with a pretty tough election coming up for Harry S. Truman, he was selected to be the next U.S. minister to Liberia. We didn't have ambassadors at the time. It was just a ministerial position. And he was selected to serve as to be the next U.S. minister. And as Dudley told me, he said, I just thought we'd be there for a few months. He thought, like everybody else, Truman was going to lose. But he thought, well, this would be fun. And he got there, and of course, Truman won. And almost as soon as Truman won in 1949, we raised the status of the U.S. mission to embassy level, and Dudley was therefore named the first African American ambassador in Liberia. And he worked hard in Liberia. He was a consummately qualified diplomat, but one of the things he was most proud of was breaking down that Negro circuit. He hounded the Department of State and Foreign Service to find appointments outside of that Negro circuit for the African Americans, most of whom were at Liberia, or they ended up in Liberia at one point or another. And his constant barrage of memorandums and working with people inside the Department of State, he actually did break it down. I mean, the wall didn't just completely collapse, but suddenly African Americans are being appointed to positions in Paris. Suddenly they're being appointed to positions in India. And he deserves a lot of credit for that, breaking down. But when Eisenhower came in 1953, he submitted his resignation as ambassador, as most political appointees do. And that was the end of his diplomatic career. So he served in Liberia for about 5 years.
Okay. And let's jump to the Kennedy Johnson years. In the State Department, is always very guarded about the fact that there's so much entrenchment, or other, like the government, just like the presidency, just seems to dislike the Foreign Service. And they really just look at these Foreign Service officers as pencil pushers. But I think that, thinking and reading about the history of presidents and how Foreign Service officers or Foreign Service kind of, resisted any forms at integration, you can sort of see why that maybe some of these administrations would look at the Foreign Service as a detriment to progress. Could you talk a little bit about the Kennedy Johnson years for African American diplomats?
Yeah, when I started the book, I originally thought that there would be a tremendous surge of progress during the 1960s with Kennedy and Johnson, that combined with the growing success of the civil rights movement, that finally those walls would start to break down in the State Department and Foreign Service. And sure enough, as almost every presidential administration did since Harry Truman right on to the present, when it first came in, the Kennedy administration, and when Johnson became president, they both dedicated themselves to the idea that we need to diversify. We need a more diverse Foreign Service. And of course, a lot of that tied back into the civil rights movement here at home, but they also did tie it into foreign policy issues. We're still getting hammered in the foreign field because of our civil rights issues, because of our lack of progress on the civil rights front. And so appointing African American ambassadors, appointing African American officials, appointing African American USIA officials this was all seen as something that would rebound to our favor in terms of international opinion. Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State during that time, he came in and he also dedicated himself to saying that this is something that needs to change. And there was a tremendous surge of optimism from the African American press, from African American non-governmental organizations. They believed that finally the walls would come down, the Lily White Club would finally be integrated. There were some initial successes. You had the first foreign service, the first African American foreign service officer who actually got an ambassadorial appointment happened during the Kennedy years, Clifton Wharton, who was appointed to Norway. All of the African American ambassadors in the 1940s and 50s, and there were only 4 of them, had all been political appointees. Mm-hmm. So that was some progress. You saw Carl Rowan serve in the Department of State, serve as an ambassador, and then go and serve as director of USIA. And you did see a broadening of the appointment pattern of African Americans. The Negro circuit really did seem to be pretty much broken by that time. African Americans are seeing more opportunities. But when you start in 1961 and you go to 1969, once you get to 1969, once again, as happened again and again and again in this history, the results are fairly dismal. By the time 1969 rolls around, yes, you do have a few more African American ambassadors. The number of African American foreign service officers had increased only incrementally, I mean almost glacially, from 1961 to 1969. And this was despite all of the pronouncements, all of the conferences, all of the meetings, all of the new programs that were going to be set up. But by 1969, African American newspapers, African American intellectuals, academics, hammering away at the same issues, and African Americans in the Foreign Service and State Department saying the same thing. Once again, lots of promise, lots of optimism, but 8 years later, we're almost exactly where we started back in 1961.
And so, when what was the reaction of the white officers to this change in the 60s and 70s? You have a really interesting quote about Barbara Watson, who was appointed the head of consular affairs in 1970 during the Carter years. And there was a white officer who was like, I should have had that job. Like, she basically stole my job, and that she wasn't qualified, and that it seemed like there was a lot of hostility among white officers, even into the 70s and 80s, at the idea of African Americans, the few African Americans in the Foreign Service actually getting positions in the Foreign Service.
Yeah, and you did see that. You didn't see a whole lot of it in the official record. A lot of this was in the oral histories and the private conversations folks were having. But there was resentment. There was this feeling that, well, wait a minute. These African Americans, other minorities, they're getting a leg up. They're getting promoted simply because of their color. They're being put forward simply because of their race. Whereas here I am, I've worked for years and years, and I should be getting those positions. And of course, it's very competitive, as you well know. You've been part of the Foreign Service. It's extraordinarily competitive. There are a small number of postings and offices and positions, and so there was this feeling that wait a minute, this talk about diversifying is really it's going to negatively impact my career path. But what you also saw, and you saw it unfortunately from Dean Rusk, who I think in many ways his heart was in the right place. What you saw more forthrightly in the documentation was this idea that this talk about diversity, it's all very well and good, unless it impacts the quote unquote quality of the Foreign Service, the quality of the Department of State. And you started to see that again and again. And you started to hear it even from Rusk's own mouths about, well, we can't get too wrapped up in these ideas of diversity. We can't get too wrapped up in this idea of trying to have a Foreign Service or a State Department that simply replicates the American public. we're looking for the best and the brightest. We're looking for the elite. We're looking for the best. And yeah, of course, I think people like Rusk, when he was saying these things, I'm not sure he had any sort of racial thought in his mind, but that's really what he's saying. He's saying, well, diversity equals a lack of quality. Diversity will dilute quality. Well, how else can you read that except by suggesting that by including these other people, the
Right.
people who are not pale male from Yale, those are the folks who are going to drag the quality of the Foreign Service down. There's no other way to read it except
Right.
that
In
way.
fact, I think you even have you quote a book from a white officer in the 60s or 70s, in the tail end of his career, who said that the Foreign Service is an elite organization, and
Yeah.
when you're letting in women and black people, you're diluting. And he said it outright, like, yeah, if you let
Oh,
in black people and women, you will dilute what makes the Foreign Service elite and what makes it special in the United States and in the world.
yeah, and you could have taken those same words and put it back in that memo in 1924 to Joseph Group.
Yep.
It was the exact same thinking that the diversity and so forth. It's going to dilute this, and of course he was much more forthright than I think somebody like Dean Rusk was. But suggesting that, look, we are an elite organization. We should be proud of being an elite organization, and all of this talk about including more diversity is destructive, and that's really what he was suggesting. This is destructive to our foreign service. This is destructive to our diplomacy.
Now
And
they did have Cadillac programs and programs to bring in more African Americans in the 60s, and there was this the 1980 Foreign Service Act. Could you
right.
talk a little bit about the external pressures that forced the State Department to open up?
Sure. If you look back really to the 1940s and 50s, what you saw was intense pressure from outside groups. This was not simply something percolating within the Department of State, within the Foreign Service. I mean, certainly they knew about racial issues. Certainly they knew about the lack of diversity. But the reason why it ended up on their radar was because of these African American groups, uh, intellectuals. Howard University was a hotbed of pressure on the Department of State and the White House to try and have more African Americans in the Foreign Service, the African American press, civil rights leaders. Um, so the outside pressure cannot be overlooked. This was something that when it would start to fall off people's radars for a while, these African American groups were what kept it there. And as I said, it's non-governmental groups, it's civil rights groups, it's academic groups, um, trying to promote this, trying to push this, having meetings with Dean Acheson, having meetings with John Foster Dulles, having meetings with Dean Rusk. It's just this history of these generally quite frustrating meetings. I mean, generally speaking, when you read their summaries of these meetings that they had with these folks, they came out fairly disappointed that there wasn't more concrete action that was going to take place. There was a lot of nice rhetoric. There was a lot of sympathy for the situation. But when it came time to show those concrete results and those concrete programs and how this was going to be kept as a forefront issue, that didn't happen.
Now, it's fascinating. In your book, you talk about, I think it was in the 40s or 50s, the State Department had said that one of the barriers to African Americans actually caring about foreign policy was our reading skills.
Yeah,
Because we weren't as literate as other groups,
right.
that maybe that is
Right.
what's keeping us out of the Foreign Service, and maybe that's what's keeping us from interest in foreign policy.
Yeah.
I do want to jump to the 80s and 90s. You see a lot of African Americans who are just fed up with the service, and they decide to launch lawsuits
Yes.
against the service. But
Right.
you also see the opposite. You see a lot of white officers who are launching their own lawsuits, claiming reverse discrimination, and
Yeah.
how that's actually been one of the detriments of the State Department doing any kind of reform. Is you had a few white officers who launched their own lawsuits, regarding reverse discrimination.
Yeah.
You know, when Clinton was elected, he said he wanted a foreign service that reflected America, which is like, you know, it's fascinating that you would think that these presidents just like quote each other. You know, like these presidents, like go back and pick up a book and just like quote it verbatim.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the battles in the 80s and 90s and early 2000s within the Foreign Service over this issue of diversity?
Yeah, it got to be a much more heated battle during the 80s and 90s. Um, and I think a good part of it had to do with the fact that so little progress had been made. Not that no progress had been made. Yes, there were more African Americans who were getting ambassadorial appointments. That yes, the variety of those appointments was improving somewhat. But when you looked at the total numbers, when you looked at the ability of African Americans to rise up to policy making positions in the Department of State, the Foreign Service, that wasn't happening. And after 40 years or so, I think a number of African Americans were, as you said, sort of sick and tired of it. Tired of hearing about the promises, tired of hearing about the sympathy, tired of hearing about, yes, 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 we understand. But where are the concrete actions? Where are these concrete results? And we talked a little bit about this a couple of days ago. I really got a firsthand view of this. Just as the book was about to come out in 1999, I was asked to be on one of the Foreign Service promotion boards as a public member. And that's a program that had started back in the 1960s, that each of the Foreign Service promotion boards for the various classes of people being considered for promotion had to have a public member. And I was very excited about participating. I thought, well, I'll really be able to see what's happening, because I knew about the lawsuits that had been filed by African Americans. I knew that there had been some settlements, but even those settlements by the Department of State, one, they were fairly small settlements, at least as far as the African American folks that had brought the suits against the State Department were concerned. But also, there really wasn't anything in the settlement by the Department of State that admitted any sort of wrongdoing. It just said, well, we recognize that there have been some systemic failures here or there, and here's some money. So I thought this would be a great opportunity to see what's happening. Well, to give you a very brief, I got there and went in for the first meeting, and noticed right away that I was the only non-African American public member. That every other public member of the Foreign Service boards were African Americans, which struck me as not surprising in some ways. Obviously, they're responding to the criticisms of the African American community and African American officials, but that was striking in and of itself, I think. But then we went in for our training, and there was a long training session on diversity. This thing went on 2 or 3 hours. And one thing I remember very little about it. It just seemed to be, well, we know there have been problems, we know there have been issues, and we're going to do something about it. But what also struck me is I'm sitting out there in the audience with Foreign Service officers, and the amount of grumbling and sniping and comments about, oh, do we have to go through this again? Oh, this damn programs, these things, just the snide comments. I'm going, well, this is going to be fascinating. And so when that was pretty eye opening in terms of, here we are in 1999. This is 50 years after that memo came out in 1949 about outstanding Negroes in appropriate countries, and 50 years later, they're still trying to have these little sessions about, well, we know the problems, and we're really trying to do something about it. And by golly, we're going to do something about it this time.
Wow. And they would gripe about it in front of you.
Yeah. I'm just sitting there in the audience going, well, I don't know if I should say something. These are under their breath. These are comments to the people sitting next to them. They're not raising their hand and making these. It's just this constant sniping and grumbling. And the sighs and the rolling of the eyes about why do we have to go through this? Why are we messing with this? It was really quite eye-opening.
Mm. And you've basically been looking at the State Department, its entire history, and the history of African American diplomats. What do you think are some of the steps that can be done to change this current situation? What do you think are some things that the State Department should consider, especially given the historical context that you've seen a lot of secretaries of state and a lot of people in state be like, "Oh yeah, we have to reform," but then they never follow through with it. What are
Right.
some things that they could actually do to make the State Department better?
Well, I think there's a number of things, and stop me if I go on too long here.
No, it's fine. Go on.
But I think that first and foremost, and it sounds almost cliche, but you really do have to attack the culture of the Department of State and Foreign Service. And I mean attacking the culture on two levels, although they're interrelated. First, you do have to make the State Department and Foreign Service aware that this has been a long-standing problem. It has been a consistent problem. It has been a destructive problem. I mean, almost every policymaker who's really looked at this issue from the 1940s right up to the present day suggests that it's harmful to our nation's foreign policy to have these kinds of issues with diversity that all the nations of the world can see. So you have to, and I think one of the things that you said when we first started emailing back and forth after your op-ed piece, you were talking about how people at the State Department seemed so shocked at this issue. I'd never heard of this before. Well, my book's been out 20 years, but the idea that, well, we've never come across this before. Well, maybe they haven't. Maybe they don't hear about it in the Department of State and Foreign Service. But it's, as I said, there's an interrelated issue, and I think the other part of the culture that has to be just etched into the Department of State and Foreign Service is the overall issue of the impact of race and racism in American foreign policy. This is a long-term issue. This is an issue that has been a part of our foreign policy and our diplomacy from the beginning of this nation. It's been a destructive force. It has been a negative force. And if perhaps we can change the culture of folks that are coming into the Department of State and Foreign Service and make them understand that you've got two interconnected issues here. You've got a history of racism, which the world is well aware of. That has been destructive to our nation, that has hurt us as a nation, is hurting us as a nation right now. And you've got this other issue that the main body for carrying out our foreign policy, the Department of State, Foreign Service, are part of that problem. That they have faced those same issues of race and racism and are still trying to deal with them. If perhaps we can have an interconnection there and have an understanding of this issue, I think that's going to go a long way. But I think, too, you also have to change the bureaucracy of the Department of State. And one of the things, you talked about Terrence Todman, and when I interviewed him, talking about the fact that, yes, people come in. They come in with nice words. They come in with nice programs. They come in with all of the rah-rah slogans about how we're going to deal with this, but there's never any carry through. There's never anyone taking this to and that's what happens. I mean, it's this rise and fall. Presidential administrations come in and there's big promises and then it falls. You've got to have a bureaucratic structure in the Department of State Foreign Service that deals with this issue of diversity and diversifying our diplomatic service every single day, and not just counting the numbers and running the numbers and seeing how many African Americans, how many Latinos, how many this, how many that are coming into the Department of State. You've got to have an office, not a single person, and that's often been a problem too. There's sort of one point person. Well, point people come and go. Presidents come and go. Secretaries of State come and go. If you can set up a bureaucratic structure that deals with not simply recruitment, not sending out the nice posters about, the face of America, the State Department, Foreign Service, not simply dealing with recruitment, but also dealing with the issues of individuals, African Americans, and other minorities, when they get into the Department of State, tracking their promotion. That's one of the biggest issues, I think, with the Department of State. What are the barriers to promotion? What's happening to these folks when you do get them into the Department of State and Foreign Service? Where do they go? Do they stay down in lower services? Do they stay down in middle grades? Are they moving up into policy making positions? So that's another idea, I think. And I think as well, we do have to look at one issue that I saw when I was working with the Foreign Service Promotion Boards. And to be sure, that was a very limited, it's a few weeks working there in DC on these. But what happened was that when I was done working on the Foreign Service Promotion Board, a few weeks later, an acquaintance in the Department of State wrote me and said, how did you like it? What did you think about it? I said, well, it was interesting, eye-opening. He said, well, not a single African American in your group got promoted. And my group was looking at the higher level promotions, folks that were going to go into policy making positions. And I was disappointed by that, but I also realized that what had happened, and I said to him at the time, I said, I think if I went back and I looked at all of those files that I had that don't have names, they don't have any descriptions of racial makeup, anything else, I'll bet I could pick out with about 90% accuracy who the African American candidates were, because of my conversations with African American diplomats, because of my research. African Americans, they're hired in the Department of State, they're hired into placed into the Foreign Service, but they're very quickly shunted off into these career paths. They're shunted off into personnel. They are shunted off into public diplomacy. They're sent in terms of their foreign postings to small African nations. I mean, by the time I did my initial study of this back in 1990, 85% of African American ambassadorial appointments went to Africa or nations in Latin America with majority Black populations. And that compared to something like 28% of all ambassadorial appointments. So African American diplomats are being sent to very specific jobs in the Department of State, jobs in the Foreign Service, postings in the Foreign Service, and those are in many ways career killers. I would sit in that Foreign Service board and that they would talk about these people. Well, they've worked with NATO, they've worked in Paris, they've worked here, they've worked there. And what you're seeing, and it's in the GAO report that just came out. It said, that they've noticed this. The State Department will not admit it, Foreign Service will not admit it, but GAO noticed this, that at mid-level, when these folks should be moving up into higher positions, because of where they have been slotted in their earlier career development, they're not going to go any farther. Not because they did bad work, but because they're put in these, they've been serving in public diplomacy, they've been serving over here, they've been serving in these tiny, inconsequential nations. Well, if you keep slotting people into those career paths, then what you have constructed is an absolutely almost impermeable barrier for these folks to move up into any sort of policy making, higher level positions. And I think finally, and I'll end with this comment. I think there has to be a real, not just reaching out to the African American community by the Department of State and the Foreign Service, but there has to be this effort to work more closely with the African American community. I believe there still is an intense interest in the African American community in foreign policy issues. I also believe there is a tremendous belief among much of the African American community that there are not careers for them in the Department of State. There are not careers for them in Foreign Service. There may be some jobs every now and then, but it's not really a career track. And I think what has to happen when all of these other issues are taken care of is that there has to be a reaching out to the African American community, but the African American community also has to start making the sort of sustained pressure, the sustained pushes, because that's what kept it on the radar. That's what put it in the laps of people in the White House. That's what put it in the laps of people in the State Department and Foreign Service. And you know, even as I'm saying all of that, I'm going, boy, that's a lot to undertake.
But it's been done before, and it'll continue to be done. You know?
It has, and we've had over, you know, we've now had about almost 70 years of sort of twiddling our thumbs and saying, you know, as this GAO report said, I think the comment from the State Department is, we recognize this is a problem and we're going to do better.
Yep. Every Secretary of State, you could have quoted that from any Secretary of State from Sherman Adams on, or the 1950s on to today, and they all say the same thing.
Exactly.
So,
yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Professor. This was a really enlightening conversation. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for your book as well. I highly recommend it for anybody, Black Diplomacy. And unfortunately, you know, fortunately, unfortunately, when these things happen, I know you get called to come to the State Department to speak, and then it kind of goes away, and then it comes back, and then it goes away. So I'm hoping this time it will be a sustained conversation, and that people will want to hear from you, and want to find ways to fix the State Department. So thanks everybody for watching, and thank you guys for everything today. Okay, and thanks, Professor.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
No problem. Thank you.
Okay.